How did we get to this moment? I think is a key question from the historical point of view. As a generation coming up in the 60s, as a teenager in the 60s, then there was a particular formation that came from the Vietnam War, that came from the whole situation with liberation movements in the Third World. That was what was once called the Third World. As we organized, one of the things that we did was look at liberation movements as an example, because it was about not just reforming the system, but changing the system. And there was a whole number of avenues by which we could change the system. Some people wanted to do it through armed struggle. Some other people wanted to do it through electoral politics. When we started, we pulled the organization, and it was usually, if I can show you, one leader, and the one leader was supposed to be the symbolic leader that, I guess, never slept, never rested, always had the strength to continue and to be the example, and thus I call it pulling the train of the movement. So if that leader was pulling the movement at all times, then there was advancement, there was movement forward. And so what happened if they killed that leader, or they jailed that leader, and how many movements have come down and failed because the leader was assassinated or jailed or quit or sold out? There were so many examples that we went through. In the 70s, different than the 60s, 70s, there was the school walkouts. There was a whole new, younger generation, or a more broader part of that young generation of that time that joined the movement and became more of a populist movement. But it was still the one leader, but instead of pulling the train, now it was pushing the train. As long as he pushed people forward, they would continue to act out that revolutionary social change. However, if you deferred with the leadership, then that caused a lot of splits. Every time that somebody disagreed, we would split. So how many times can you split? So that showed our immaturity to be able to deal with a multiple amount of thinking and lines rather than one political line. So the one political line made it very difficult for the movement to grow horizontally. So movements grew very much vertically. A lot of membership, or a lot of different projects, a lot of different fronts, but it was still the same one leader, or it could be more than one, could be two or three, but it would be basically still the one leader concept. In the 80s, there was a break. A lot of those movements ended there, closed shop, transformed into something else. And it was very interesting because that's also when the right-wing Newt Gingrich revolution took place, and Ronald Reagan becomes president. The movement transformed, went from being the centralized committee or the one leader, a big movement or coalition or whatever, went into sort of submerged themselves. We submerged ourselves in the community and started to organize around specific issues that were being faced by the community. So the movement was seeking to create power by creating intersectionality of issues. But that intersectionality was somewhat mechanical in nature and short-lived initiative. It was not the long-term liberation vision that the 60s and 70s movement have had. So they became more short-sighted, more immediate, more pragmatic, and more issue-driven, which made it then parallel, because all the issues then travel in a parallel line rather than really meeting at one point. So if we travel like that, then you can win an issue and lose the war. So then we went into, in the 90s with the beginning of the free trade agreements and globalization as we begin to understand it. And as a movement, as an anti-globalization movement or anti-neoliberal globalization movement, then we went to Seattle to fight the free trade agreements, now under the rubric of the World Trade Organization. That protest in the Battle of Seattle was so tremendous and impactful that it shut down the WTO meeting. It not only did that, but it raised a number of key questions what is the political moment today under the neoliberals? What is we need to have a connection with the global South movements. So we came up with a process to organize the first U.S. Social Forum as a way to grow movement within the U.S., as a way to connect with the global South and be part of making another world possible. Then we actually had a more formal social movements assembly process with the explicit goal of action. Then the People's Movement Assembly, as we established for the Atlanta first ever U.S. Social Forum, then became the mechanism for action. The open space for deliberation and sharing of knowledge, and the People's Movement Assembly for action.